আপনাদের সকলকে আবারও আমন্ত্রণ জানাচ্ছি আজকে আমাদের এই ক্রিমিনাল ল বিষয়ক আইনি অনুষ্ঠান ক্রিমিনাল জাস্টিস প্রোগ্রাম দেখবার জন্য। আমি এবং আমার কলিগ ব্যারিস্টার তারা মেখার্টি আমরা সে একটা খুব বড় বিশাল একটা ফ্রড কেলেঙ্কারি পুরা ইউকে ব্যাপী যেটা হয়েছে 12 মিলিয়ন পাউন্ডের, এইটার উপর আমরা কথা বলছি। সেখানে আপনার সিগনেচার ফরজারি করা হয়েছে, বোগাস লেটার হেড প্রিপেয়ার করেছে, ইমেইল করেছে বোগাস, এবং এই ফ্রডস্টাররা বিভিন্ন ধরনের এই আপনার এই ফ্রডুলেন্ট অ্যাক্টিভিটিস গুলো করে, লাইক দা লগো চেঞ্জ করেছে লেটার হেডের মধ্যে, এগুলো অনেক সময় তারা তখন ধরা পড়ছে এবং ওখান থেকে আপনার ইনভেস্টিগেশন ট্রিগার করছে। এবং তারা এইভাবে এই বিভিন্ন সংস্থা থেকে যে গর্নসি গভর্নমেন্ট, এনএইচএস ট্রাস্ট এবং হসপিটাল, বিভিন্ন ইউনিভার্সিটি, বিভিন্ন প্রতিষ্ঠান, কাউন্সিল, বিভিন্ন বড় বড় প্রতিষ্ঠান যেগুলোতে আপনার অ্যাকাউন্টিং সিস্টেমটা একটু ভালনারেবল আছে, যারা মনে করে কি এগুলো সরকারি প্রতিষ্ঠান, এগুলো কোনো ব্যক্তিগত প্রতিষ্ঠান না, ওগুলোর উপরে তারা হানা দিলে তারা এগুলো সুবিধা করতে পারবে, ইনভেস্টিগেশনটা কম হবে। কিন্তু শেষ পর্যন্ত একটা এনএইচএস এর মানে প্রতিষ্ঠানে যখন এইটা করেছে এবং সেখানে একজন এমপ্লয়ি সে বুঝতে পেরেছে যে লগোটা লেটার হেডের এটা একটা ডিফারেন্ট জায়গায় চলে গেছে, এটা জেনুইন দেখা যাচ্ছে না, সিগনেচারটা মানে জেনুইন দেখা যাচ্ছে না, রেফারেন্স নাম্বারটা লেটারের মধ্যে রং রেফারেন্স নাম্বার দিয়েছে, তখন সে পুলিশরে অ্যালার্ট করেছে এবং তখন থেকেই আপনার পুলিশি অভিযান শুরু হয়েছে এবং এই পুলিশি অভিযানের নাম দেওয়া হয়েছিল অপারেশন টার্লাক। we go one by one who suffered and how did it happen. Tara, the next one, I would say something. The police officer, the detective sergeant, he said, I am pleased to say that with the assistance of law enforcement in Dubai, Poland and other countries, this investigation has got to the heart of this conspiracy and has disabled what was clearly an international organized crime group. So would you say something on this one?
Yes. So the fraud in this case and the fraudsters in this case identified what they thought were vulnerable but high value targets, which is the local authorities and the public bodies. But then what they realized they needed to do was, in order to make the fraud completely successful, the money had to be diverted immediately away from the UK, because the UK financial authority has lots of checks and balances and lots of rules. So for a fraud to be successful, it doesn't, of this type where you're taking huge quantities of money, you've got to get the money out of the UK and into an area where there are fewer checks and balances, there are fewer rules, you're going to have fewer suspicions. So the money is diverted away from the legitimate source and then out of the UK. Now, in this case, the fraudsters, I guess, were banking on the fact that once out of the UK, the authorities or the particular countries that the money was diverted through, Poland, Dubai, places such as that, were not going to then cooperate with the UK authorities and provide them with information in order for the fraud to be tracked. And what the comments of the officer investigating this case show is, in fact, that's not the case, and fraudsters can't rely on that, because what happened is the authority, the investigating authority, the police in the UK, were able to work with police forces and financial authorities abroad, which then enabled them to find out where the money had gone and try and trace those responsibles. Unfortunately, in this particular case, I suspect the money went and disappeared because the money disappears so quickly. But in truth, this level of cooperation stopped the fraud from continuing after once it was discovered, and meant that the money transfers were then not effective, because of course as soon as your authority in Poland or the authorities in Dubai become aware that this particular money is coming in through these particular accounts and this particular mechanism, that gets stopped. Unfortunately, though, where one stops, fraudsters then find another route for the money to be dissipated. But in this case, the investigation highlighted an area where local authorities and public bodies were vulnerable, and the police investigation and the way in which it worked and the network of investigators meant that they were able to stop it and save public funds from being used in this fraud.
Yeah. And judge said sophisticated.
I mean, absolutely. This is an incredibly sophisticated way of stealing money. I mean, ultimately, a fraud is where I con you into handing over something that you don't want to give to me and I have no right to. And here, the way in which the fraudsters operated, so setting up a network of people who were able to work quickly and efficiently together to create a deception. So you're a public authority and you're building something. I find out about it. I then set up a scheme where I convince what is a legitimate payment to be diverted through the use of fake emails, fake accounts, fake details, although they look really close to the real details. And then it's transferred into my fake account and then it's taken away and diverted out of the UK. And this is the kind of fraud where there are layers and layers and layers of individuals involved. And unfortunately, sometimes there is corruption of people who work for local authorities, not always. Sometimes there's people who are corrupt within the money transfer system, and sometimes people corrupt officials out of the UK. But what happens is your money is legitimate, and it's really only the vigilance of certain individuals that spot that actually a legitimate transaction, because this is a transaction that you as the public body are expecting to happen. You're expecting to make your monthly payment for that hospital building, for that airport, whatever it happens to be. It's not that you're not expecting it. And so the money goes, and it's not really until the source where the money is supposed to end up comes back and says, hold on, we've missed a payment for this month. Where is it? That suddenly alarm bells seem to be raised. But of course, by that stage, the money is long gone. And of course, here, there are quite strict rules about how money, large sums of money, is moved. So often you can't move a greater sum than £5,000 or £10,000. But of course, if it's a regular payment by a local authority to a contractor, which everyone's expecting to happen, the things in place for that large sum of money to be moved. And so again, it's really a clever and sophisticated way of stealing legitimate money and then covering your traces. And the tactics, the planning involved is quite extraordinary, and also the use of IT, because these frauds work because IT is in place, which would enable the money then to be transferred very quickly elsewhere. But equally, this is high risk. It's only going to last for so long, because you, as the builder, are suddenly going to say, "Where's my money? I'm doing my work. I was due a regular payment. Where is it?" So these are high risk frauds and won't last long necessarily. But obviously the rewards, as far as the fraudsters are concerned, are worth it, because there is a high amount of money, a large amount of money, which will then be transferred. So high risk, but high value. And that's often the case in terms of things that are sophisticated. And of course, here as well, what you had is fraudsters taking advantage of the fact that if you have a public sector body which is doing work, it has to publish information about what it's doing, who it's paying. And so that makes them incredibly vulnerable to be targeted by fraudsters who look out for that kind of information. And I think that was something that the judge made reference to when he was sentencing them, because it has to be an aggravating feature that they're using or taking advantage of a public authority needing to be transparent and providing this information, but at the same time making them vulnerable.
Yeah. And the judge said the loss falls necessarily on those who are not able to pay it. Ultimately, the members of the public whose taxes fund these bodies, he said. That means they targeted all those government bodies.
Well, they do, and that ultimately targets us, those of us who pay tax. And these NHS trusts are expensive to run and provide services for the public, because that's how the NHS works. And these frauds are particularly unpleasant because local authorities and NHS trusts don't have unlimited funds, and they have really important things that they need to be spending it on. I mean, and this is very, at the moment with COVID and the costs rising as a result of the COVID pandemic, local authorities and NHS trusts don't have lots of money. So these are, whilst they may spend lots of money, they don't have money to waste, and they don't have money which can just be easily targeted and then easily replaced. And so it's really very sad how these frauds have targeted those who really can't afford to pay it, because where does the NHS trust get its money from? It gets its money from taxes, and that then affects all of us. And so it's very sad, really.
And an investigation took 4 years. Police took that Operation Tarlac. Is a very long investigation.
Yes.
4 years.
I mean, often these types of investigations do take an awful long time. I mean, all of us who work in the criminal justice system at the moment are feeling the impact of any investigation taking a long time. Even a fairly simple offence can often take the police because they are so busy and because their resources are limited. But in this particular instance, this was an investigation which had an awful lot of resources put into it and still took a long time. But that's because of the sophisticated nature of it, the fact that individuals were all over the country, and I think in different parts of the world as well. And I think there are people who are still part of this conspiracy who have never been arrested, although I think some of them have been identified. And it was also the kind of fraud which wasn't just in one location. There are different cases, sort of satellite cases, but linked because of the nature of the fraud in different parts of the UK. And so it's very difficult in those circumstances to keep any police investigation short. It is going to take time because of the complex nature of it.
Yeah. দর্শক, এখানে একজনকে অলরেডি জেল সাজা দিয়েছিল 2015 সালের সেপ্টেম্বর মাসে আপনার সাদার ক্রাউন কোর্টে 11 বছরের তাকে জেল সাজা দিয়েছিল। মানে এই অপরাধী চক্রের একজনকে অলরেডি বিগত জীবনের এবং মানি লন্ডারিং এর জন্য এবং অ্যাকুয়ারিং ক্রিমিনাল প্রপার্টি এই অপরাধগুলোর জন্য অলরেডি সাদার ক্রাউন কোর্টে তাকে আলাদাভাবে 2015 সালে সেপ্টেম্বর মাসে তার সাজা দেওয়া হয়েছিল। এটা কিন্তু অনেক বড় চক্র, এবং তারা এই শুধু ইউকের মধ্যে না, তারা বিভিন্ন দেশের সাথে তারা লিঙ্ক করে এই ফ্রডুলেন্ট অ্যাক্টিভিটি গুলো চালিয়ে গেছে হোল ইউকে ওয়াইড। The sentencing was about 10 years, I think. Yeah, maximum that was given 10 years. Yeah. I don't want to go in details of the sentencing for each person, but I want to go for again the NHS Foundation, Lincolnshire partnership, and then and about the Guernsey government. How have they recovered some of their money? If you can say something about those things.
Well, I think certainly in respect of those, they did manage to recover some of the money, because once they identified where the accounts that they were going into, they were then able to recover or claw back some of the transactions before they were going. But I don't think they've ever managed to recover the entire amount. And that's one of the problems with this type of fraud, that once the money goes out of the UK, it's then almost impossible to claw back and to identify, and it just gets spent immediately. I mentioned earlier about a racehorse being bought, which obviously led to people, the authorities, being suspicious as to why money was being diverted towards a racehorse. But and that was in respect of the Guernsey fraud. And in fact, in that case, I think they were able to recover the value of the racehorse. But it's very difficult, because once the money goes out of the genuine account into the fraudster's account, it just disappears. And it's because fraudsters seem to have the ability, and know they have to do this, move assets immediately and sophisticated and hide where they put them. And so it is very difficult to recover. And that's one of the reasons why you mentioned a sentence of 10 years imprisonment, which is an incredibly long period of time for anyone to receive. And the reason people who commit these offences get those high sentences is to reflect the fact that, A, it's highly sophisticated and very clever, targeting vulnerable organisations. But also an element of it is the fact the money never gets recovered. And whilst there can be, as I'm sure many of your viewers may be aware, if you commit a crime with a financial element to it, there can be separate proceedings under the Proceeds of Crimes Act to try and recover that money. And that often happens in this case, in these types of cases where there's high value fraud. But the difficulty is that fraudsters are often very clever at hiding their own assets. And so unless there is an allegation of hidden assets made against them, the authorities recover very little of the money. But in this case, I think that they struggled to recover very much of the money. Yes, there were Proceeds of Crime Act proceedings against some of the defendants who had assets, but that no way reflected the amount of money that was actually taken from the local authority in the first instance. And that's why the sentences are high, because the state wants to mark the seriousness of this offending, not only in terms of its sophistication, but in fact the fact the money never really comes back.
Most of the money gone offshore, isn't it?
That's right, which makes it very hard to recover, because if you've and often these are not this is not done in a way through a single bank account. You will have the money be transferred by the local authority into a single bank account. It's then split up into smaller amounts being transferred into multiple other accounts. And so it's tracing it that becomes incredibly complex. And so whilst you can sometimes recover some of it, tracing it once it goes out of the UK and then trying to recover it is almost impossible. And that's the sad fact of these cases, that yes, you can, those that get prosecuted here, you can recover some money from them, but you can't recover everything unless they have particularly high assets. Now, obviously, if someone has a house and owns a house, that can be a high asset and that would be seized. But I mean, that often doesn't happen. Fraudsters, are sophisticated individuals. They make sure they don't have assets easily identifiable, which is how they get away with it. And so that's the sad part of it. Not only do they get transferred abroad, but there isn't really very much money here in the UK for the authorities to seize. And that is an additional complexity.
Yeah. One of the aspect in the fraud case is, like in the rape case, one can get 20, 30 years, even life imprisonment. But although here is 10 years in the fraud case, but there will be a separate, as you have mentioned, the proceedings for the confiscation proceedings. The people cannot, keep the money they have earned with their criminal activities. So that is quite draconian process to go through the whole system, what they have earned in their whole life, what they have assets in the UK or even abroad, and then they all can be recoverable through meet this amount of the confiscation order.
I mean, yes, that's absolutely right. And one of the sad things about this is the genuinely sophisticated fraudster knows that. They know that any assets they have here will be seized by the state, and they know the draconian nature. What you often find is, though, that other people who are not as sophisticated get caught up in this. So somebody ordinary makes a bad decision, gets caught up in a fraud, and then they find, but they're the ones who own a house and they've paid their mortgage off because they've, up until this, worked really hard. And suddenly they find themselves, as you've said, through this draconian process, losing their house, losing what they've earned over their whole working career because they've got involved with sophisticated fraudsters. And that's the sort of interesting dilemma of the Proceeds of Crime Act and confiscation proceedings, because they are draconian, because they're aiming at targeting sophisticated people who know how to hide assets, but they often catch much less sophisticated people, but people who get nonetheless caught up in these frauds, sometimes through selfish reasons, sometimes through just fate. And then they end up losing houses, property, all of the things which they've spent their legitimate time and money building up and buying, and they make a mistake and get involved in a fraud, and then suddenly they find that these proceedings mean they've lost their house. And it can be devastating for people who have spent a lifetime saving up to buy a house or paying a mortgage, to then suddenly find that this type of criminality or involvement in these types of frauds means they lose it. And yet the main players, the real sophisticated fraudsters, get away with it. And this is why I think that the authorities are trying to use more and more the hidden assets aspect, because they know that the main fraudsters, sort of the principal of the fraud, the one that's really coordinating it, who appears on the face of it to have nothing here, in fact, they're the ones with the assets. And at least if they do make an allegation of hidden assets and that's found to be proved, then the court can impose periods of in custody in default to try and force them to pay. And as you will know, those periods in default are served in full. So you can be sentenced to 10 years, which you don't spend all of that time in custody. But if you have a period in default for, say, 10 years because you owe £10 million or whatever the figure, that whole period is spent in custody. That's how they're trying to hit people.
I think we are end of time this segment. You will continue on the next segment again. দর্শক, আমরা শর্ট একটা ব্রেকে যাচ্ছি। আমি আজাম এন্ড কো সলিসিটার্স এর প্রিন্সিপাল সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম, এবং আমার সাথে আছেন দীর্ঘ সেই 25 বছরের এক্সপেরিয়েন্সড অভিজ্ঞতা সম্পন্ন ক্রিমিনাল লয়ের স্পেশালিস্ট ব্যারিস্টার, আমার কলিগ ব্যারিস্টার তারা মেঘার্টি। সবাই আমাদের সাথেই থাকুন। নেক্সট সেগমেন্টে আমরা আবার এই বড় ফ্রড কেসের উপর আরো কন্টিনিউ করব।